Welcome to World History Notes, where I read from the book I wrote to teach homeschoolers world history. A Bible Believer Looks at World History, which you can find on lulu.com, amazon.com, or at the Bible Baptist bookstore. I'm going to get back to China now. We're in the first century in that era. Across the Pacific, the era opens up with Buddhism coming to China in 67 AD. Of course, these dates are all approximate. In China, just as a side note, as we were discussing Teotihuacan, human sacrifice was practically unknown after the collapse of the Shang dynasty. Events of note in the later Han dynasty in this period include the rebellion of the Yellow Turbans, a Taoist uprising against the tyranny of what is called the later Han dynasty. This occurred in the 180s AD. Taoism is the religion founded by Lao Tzu, the old master, several hundred years earlier. This rebellion resulted in the poet Tsao rising to power and leaving his son as the first Wei emperor in 220. The period of the three kingdoms begins, during which China is split into three separate kingdoms: the Shu, 221 to 264, the Wei, 220 to 265, and the Wu, 220 to 280. Cao is worthy of note because many sources say he is the most favorite figure of Chinese folklore in real life, and in real life was a brilliant general who saved northern China from chaos as the Han Dynasty was collapsing. The origins of Cao are fuzzy since his father was the adopted son of a powerful eunuch. This meant that the Tsao family was a rich one, but newly rich and of questionable lineage. An unruly and wild youth, Tsao was greatly pleased when a famous judge of character predicted that he would be, quote, an able public servant in a world at peace, or a crafty, deceitful hero in a world at war. The world was at war, one of the bloodiest China had ever seen, and Cao threw himself into the battle in 184, helping to quell the rebellion of the Yellow Turbans. The so-called Taiping Rebellion that was to serve as a prototype for similar popular uprisings for 2 millennia. The influence of his father and in recompense for his actions, Cao rose in rank. When the empire was threatened by Tong Chou, a brutal warlord who captured the emperor and burned the capital, Cao fled to the provinces where he raised his own troops to fight, ostensibly to save the Han Empire from total destruction. The next 20 years of his life were years of anarchic fighting among his warlord enemies. In 200, at the Battle of Quantu, Honan, he defeated Yuan Shao, and after continual battles against the Yuan family, Liu Piao and Wan, Tsao became the sole power in the north. In 208, another famous battle at Chi Pi on the south bank of the Yangtze in Hupei showed he could not defeat his combined enemies in Wu and Shu. The end of his life was spent in consolidating his hold on the north, by far the most important part of China, becoming prime minister in 208, Duke of Wei in 213, and Prince of Wei in 216. At his death on March 15, 220, he still had not taken the imperial title. This his son, Xiao Pi, did, becoming the first emperor of the Wei dynasty on December 11th, 220. Cao's importance was hotly debated in China in 1959. Whatever Chow's attitude toward the common people were, whether progressive or reactionary, it is a fact that he made intelligent use of military agricultural colonies, Chun Tien, near his capital, in which soldiers were set to farming unused farmland, reorganized and reused taxes, and by the repopulation of vast areas had been devastated by the unceasing wars. He succeeded in bringing peace and prosperity to North China and reestablishing a unified empire. His policies for appointing men only by their talent and an attempt to strengthen the central government by ignoring the new real powers in the land, the rich regional landowners, ultimately were doomed to failure. But his disdain for Confucian tradition helped free intellectuals and paved the way for a renaissance of thought and literature. Cao himself was a powerful poet and prose writer. For many Chinese, however, Cao remains the arch villain of history, immortalized in the novel Sanguo Qu Yanyi, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, as a crafty and unscrupulous usurper. In 265, the Western Qin dynasty begins with the Wei kingdom absorbs the Shu, then later the Wu. 280, it lasts until 316, after a period of civil tension added by the enlistment of barbarian forces leads to internal decay. Excuse me. A condition of unrest unfolds for the next 200 years as remnants of the old empire fight against invading barbarians. Now let's back up to the introduction of Buddhism into Chinese culture for a moment. The form of Buddhism that came to China was not the thoughtful agnostic Buddhism of Siddhartha, but the superstitious paganism that developed in later times. Although there were elements of true Buddhism in its benign neglect of gods and deities, the form of Buddhism that came to China introduced such things as faith healing, hypnotism, autosuggestion, and meditation arts as components of medical practice. As Durant states when talking about Buddhism's introduction to Japan in the 500s, and I quote from page 833 from his first volume in the Story of Civilization entitled Our Oriental Heritage, it was not Buddha's Buddhism that came, agnostic, pessimistic, and Puritan, dreaming of blissful extinction. It was the Mahayana Buddhism of gentle gods and personal immortality. When referring to the introduction of Buddhism to China, he says on page 786, quote, the Buddhism that began its migration to India from China in the first century after Christ was not the hard and gloomy doctrine that the enlightened one had preached 500 years before. It was no ascetic creed, but a bright and happy faith in helping deities and a flowering paradise that took the form as time went on of the greater vehicle, or Mahayana, which Kanishka's theologians had adapted to the emotional needs of simple men. It presented China with freshly personal and humane gods like Amitabha, ruler of paradise, and Kuan Yin, god and goddess of mercy. It filled the Chinese pantheon with Lohans or Arbats, 18 of the original disciples of Buddha, who stood ready at every turn to give of their merits to help a bewildered and suffering mankind. Unquote. Um, I think that should have been migration to China from India. Uh, but anyway, while the Roman Emperor Constantine was creating the state church of Rome based on a nominal Christianity, and while that apostate version of the Christian faith was beginning to count on things never mentioned by Christ or even intimated by his apostles, but constructed out of thin air for the purpose of validating the state church setup and anesthetizing the spiritual desires of the people, the very same thing was being done in China and India with regard to the religion of Buddhism. My comments should not be misconstrued as being an endorsement of or lending credibility to the satanic counterfeit of Buddhism, in that Buddha cannot save you and never promised that he could, but merely offered another atheistic philosophy for mankind, understanding that an agnostic is an atheist who is too much of a coward to admit it. But it's only to say that there is a theme running through history, and Satan counterfeits God in certain ways and then counterfeits the counterfeit, leading his victims further and further down a road of thought from which it becomes harder and harder to depart. On a lighter note, in the 100s, the Chinese figured out that magnetic silver, allowed to turn freely, always points north-south. Also, at that time, it was discovered that dried chrysanthemum flowers can kill insects. So they invented a powder that was the world's first known insecticide. Integrated pest management began in the 300s when his Han records show how to use specific types of ants to control other insect pests attacking mandarin oranges. The inventor, Tsai Lun, devised paper produced cheaply from wood, rags, and other substances containing cellulose, as opposed to papyrus in Egypt made from a reed or parchment made from animal hides. This great discovery did not reach Europe until 1320. Contrast this discovery with the superstitious Taoist Chang Daoling composing a guide to charms and incantations to cure disease. Notice that while this was going on, the Greek physician Galen was dissecting animals and applying the results to human beings, sometimes mistakenly, but affecting Western medicine for 17 centuries. Soranus of Ephesus was writing on gynecology, obstetrics, and infant diseases, as well as describing rickets, defined by the online American Heritage Dictionary as, quote, a deficiency disease resulting from a lack of vitamin D or calcium and from insufficient exposure to sunlight, characterized by defective bone growth and occurring chiefly in children. But the Chinese, not to be outdone in the development of early sciences in 185, noted that they observed a supernova in the constellation Centaurus for 20 months. They calculated pi to 5 decimal places between the time that Ptolemy was writing on trigonometry in 140 and Diophantus was working on the beginnings of algebra in 250. Then a breakthrough was made in China that puts them far ahead of the game by man's emphasis. In 270, Wu Dynasty alchemists manufactured gunpowder from sulfur and saltpeter. They never got around to using it as effectively as the West did for the purpose of mass murder. Next, we're going to begin with Rome after the Council of Nicaea, up until the plague that swept the world, wiping out the old cultures and giving newer ones the opportunity to conquer what had before been unconquerable and creating a modern world and basically killing the ancient world. So we'll continue there next time. And I look forward to talking to you again. Take care.